Welcome back to QHSE Talks and to episode 8 of our CSP series. Now, let me start with a simple but uncomfortable truth. Most workplaces know their hazards and still get exposure wrong. They know solvents are used, they know dust is generated, they know vapors are present. But knowing something exists is not the same as knowing what it's doing to a human body over time. And this is where industrial hygiene draws a very sharp line between perception and proof. Because in the real world of professional safety practice, especially at the CSP level, we think it's okay is not a defensible position. It's not defensible to management, it's not defensible to regulators, and it's certainly not defensible after an occupational illness has already occurred. Industrial hygiene is not about reacting to symptoms. It's about preventing them before the first cough, before the first abnormal lab result, before the first compensation claim. And that prevention depends on one thing: measurement. Air sampling is where industrial hygiene stops being a concept and becomes a discipline. It's where experience alone is no longer enough, where intuition is replaced by methodology, where decisions are anchored to numbers that mean something. Because exposure is not just about what is in the air, it's about how much, for how long, how often, and under what conditions. A few minutes of high concentration can be very different from a full shift of low-level exposure. A short task performed once a week is not the same as a task repeated every hour. And a measurement taken in the corner of a room tells you something very different from a measurement taken in a worker's breathing zone. This is why air sampling is not a box-ticking exercise. Done correctly, it answers critical questions. Are workers actually overexposed? Are our controls working or just assumed to be working? Is PPE genuinely required, or are we compensating for poor engineering? And most importantly, are we protecting health, not just avoiding citations? In this episode, we are not just going to talk about pumps, filters, and instruments. We are going to talk about confidence, the kind of confidence that allows a safety professional to say, this exposure has been evaluated, quantified, and controlled. But to get there, the first step is not equipment. The first step is mindset. You have to understand the difference between simply recognizing a hazard and being able to quantify exposure with precision. And that distinction is the foundation of everything that follows.
Right. And that first critical step in industrial hygiene is just getting your head around that distinction. Hazard awareness is only the starting line.
It's not enough to just know something is there.
Not at all. Knowing solvent vapors exist in a room is one thing, but being able to state with confidence that a worker is exposed to 80 parts per million averaged over 8 hours.
That's a different game entirely.
That's a completely different game. And that precision demands a rigorous methodology.
And I think a lot of professionals, their first instinct is to reach for a tool that gives them a quick check. We're talking about direct reading instruments, right?
Exactly. And direct reading instruments are, they're invaluable tools for initial surveys, for finding a leak, for an emergency.
You want that instant feedback.
You need that instant feedback. They're calibrated for specific contaminants, and they pull a sample into the device for immediate analysis. We use things like photoionization detectors, or PIDs, or flame ionization detectors, FIDs.
But it's critical to understand their limits.
It is. You have to know what they're good for, and maybe more importantly, what they're not good for.
So tell us a bit more about those limitations. If I get a reading right away from my PID, why can't I just use that number for my official compliance assessment?
That's a great question. PIDs and FIDs, they're fantastic screening tools, but they just don't have the specificity you need for compliance.
What do you mean by specificity?
Okay, so a PID, for instance, uses UV light to ionize molecules. It measures the charge that's created. They're super sensitive, especially to things like benzene and other aromatic compounds.
So they pick things up easily.
Very easily. But they respond differently to every single chemical, and they often can't tell the difference between them.
Yeah.
And some things like low molecular weight gases like methane, A standard PID might not even see it.
So it might give you a number, but you don't really know what that number represents.
Precisely. And an FID is similar. It actually burns the sample in a tiny flame. It's excellent for quantifying total hydrocarbons, like if you have a mix of different solvents.
Okay.
But you need compressed fuel for it, which makes it harder to use in the field. And again, you're getting a reading for a whole class of chemicals, not the exact concentration of the one contaminant you might be regulated on.
So to sum it up, instant data is fantastic for troubleshooting.
Yes.
But for assessing chronic risk, which is really what PELs are designed for, we have to use something else. We need precise, legally defensible data.
And that's where sampling methodologies come in. That's the core of what we're talking about today.
This is a different approach entirely.
Completely.
Yeah.
With sampling methodologies, you're actively collecting a contaminant onto a physical medium, a filter, a sorbent tube, even a bag over a set period of time.
And then that medium gets sent off.
Right. To a highly specialized lab. And this whole process, it has to follow these very detailed procedures set by authoritative bodies.
Yeah.
You can't deviate.
And for the professional in the field, you have to know which playbook you're using.
You do. There are 3 core resources you live by. The first is the NOSH Manual of Analytical Methods. That's really the gold standard for a lot of analyses.
Okay.
Then there's the OSHA Index of Analytical Methods. And
Yeah.
critically, there are the specific requirements from the analytical lab itself.
So the lab has its own rules.
They do. And these sources, together, they govern everything. The type of filter, the flow rate for your pump, the total volume of air you need to sample. It's all prescribed.
That technical requirement leads us right to what you said is one of the most critical first steps. Before you even think about putting a pump on someone,
Yes.
selecting your analytical partner, your lab.
It is absolutely foundational. Your sample integrity, the validity of your data, it all hinges on the quality of that analysis.
And it has to hold up in court, so to speak.
It has to be validated legally and scientifically. And what's fascinating here is the absolute non-negotiable requirement for AIHA accreditation.
The American Industrial Hygiene Association.
Correct. When you use an AIHA accredited lab, you're not just buying an analysis. You're buying a whole system of quality assurance and quality control, QA/QC.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means the lab has standardized procedures. It means they participate in proficiency testing, so they're constantly being checked.
Yeah.
It means they maintain meticulous documentation.
And without that,
Without that accreditation, if you ever face an OSHA citation or you end up in litigation, the other side could successfully challenge the validity of your entire exposure assessment.
wow. So your data just gets thrown out.
Dismissed in court. The accreditation is the bedrock. It's what makes the data legally defensible.
It also sounds like the relationship with the lab is more than just transactional. It's consultative.
It absolutely should be.
Right.
They don't just, receive a box of samples in the mail. The lab director is an invaluable resource
How so?
because they know the sensitivity of their equipment. They know what their machines can reliably detect. And they know the limits of the collection, media-like, which chemicals might break down in transit.
So they can help you plan your strategy.
They help the industrial hygienist choose the most effective methodology for that specific workplace, for that specific contaminant. It's a collaboration. It has to be, to make sure the sample you collect actually gives you useful, accurate data.
Okay, so we've chosen our lab. We're moving from the who to the how. And the choice of equipment is completely dictated by what we're trying to catch.
100%. The first questions you have to ask are, is my hazard a gas, a vapor, a mist, a fume, a particulate?
And another key question, are we looking for the total amount of stuff in the air or just that respirable portion?
The fraction that can get deep into the lungs, yes, that distinction is critical.
And that physical state is what points you to the right sampling media.
Exactly. So for collecting solid particles, things like general dust, metal fumes from welding or mists, you're going to use filters.
And these come in little plastic cassettes, right?
They do. And the choice of the filter material itself, it could be PVC, mixed cellulose ester, quartz, and the pore size, that's all critical. It depends on the contaminant and what the specific analytical method requires.
Okay, so that's for particles. What about for gases and vapors, the stuff that's invisible, molecularly dispersed?
Then you're moving to sorbent tubes. These are typically little glass tubes, and they're packed with a specialized granular material, a sorbent.
And the air gets pulled through that material.
It does. And the contaminant gets trapped, either chemically or physically, onto that material. The most common sorbents are things like activated charcoal or silica gel.
And the choice there depends on the chemical you're after.
It depends entirely on the polarity and the reactivity of your target contaminant. You have to match the sorbent to the chemical.
We also see some specialized containers like sample collection bags or even canisters.
Yes, those are essential when you need to capture a whole air sample.
What does that mean, a whole air sample?
It means you want to analyze the entire sample of air completely unaltered. You're not just collecting one chemical onto a sorbent. You're grabbing a snapshot of everything that's in the air at that moment.
So what are those used for?
Typically for things like volatile organic compounds, VOCs, or specific gas mixtures, you might see these shiny stainless steel Summa canisters.
I've seen those.
They're evacuated to a near-perfect vacuum before you take them to the field. Then you just open a valve, and the workplace air rushes in to fill it. They're perfect for contaminants that are really volatile or might react with a normal sorbent.
And let's not forget passive samplers. They seem like a huge benefit because you don't need a pump.
They are simple, that's for sure.
So why wouldn't we just use them all the time?
That's a really important question. They are simple, and they work by diffusion or permeation to collect contaminants.
Yeah.
But their limitations are something a professional absolutely has to understand.
Okay.
Their collection rate, so how fast they sample, is highly dependent on things you can't easily control.
Like what?
Ambient temperature, humidity, and probably most importantly, air velocity.
The wind speed in the room, basically?
Basically, yeah. If the air around the sampler is too still, the collection rate just drops off, and your sample will come back falsely low.
So you could be underestimating the exposure.
Massively. They're generally less precise than active sampling with a pump, so they're often used more for screening than for establishing a legally defensible 8-hour time-weighted average, unless the specific method has been validated for that purpose.
This brings us to the common denominator in almost all of this, the pump. And the source material just hammers home the absolute necessity of sampling pump calibration.
It's non-negotiable, and I'll tell you exactly why. The lab analysis only tells you one thing: the mass of the contaminant they found.
Just a weight.
Just a weight, let's say 50 micrograms of lead. To get the number that matters for compliance, the concentration, which is mass per volume, you must know the precise volume of air that passed through that filter.
And if your pimp's flow rate is off?
If your flow rate is off by 10%, your final calculated concentration is off by 10%, which means your entire assessment is immediately invalid.
So what does a proper, rigorous calibration actually look like in the field?
Okay, so it has to be calibrated using what's called a primary standard, like a certified soap bubble meter, or a secondary standard, like a rotameter.
And you do this before you start sampling?
You do it both before the sampling period starts and immediately after the sampling period ends. You're checking for consistency.
Ah, so it's a check on both ends.
Yes. The pre- and post-calibration flow rates cannot differ significantly. The industry standard is typically no more than a 5% difference.
And what if it's more than that? What if you start at 2.0 liters per minute and you end at 1.8?
And you have a problem.
Yeah.
It probably means you had a kinked tube or the filter got clogged, and that sample, it may have to be thrown out. It's invalidated.
And every single one of these numbers gets recorded.
Every flow rate, every start time, every stop time, it's all meticulously recorded on the air sampling worksheet.
So we've established just how critical calibrating the pump is for getting an accurate volume. Now we have to dig into the calculations.
Right. The question shifts from can we measure the flow to how much air do we actually need to pull through the media.
This is where strategy really comes in.
It's where field strategy meets the capability of the laboratory.
And that brings up a really important point about the lab's performance. They can only measure down to a certain level, right?
Right. So we have to calculate the minimum sample volume we need.
So we collect enough for them to actually see.
Precisely. The minimum volume is all about the analytical method's limit of detection, or LOD. That's the smallest mass of a contaminant the lab can reliably tell apart from zero.
And if you collect less than that?
If the amount you collect is below the LOD, the lab report comes back and just says non-detect. And you've learned nothing. You have no useful exposure data.
So how does the hygienist figure out that minimum volume?
You have to do a little pre-calculation. You take the lab's LOD, and then based on what you sort of expect the concentration in the air to be, you calculate the minimum volume of air you'll need to pull to collect a mass that's, say, 1.5 to 2 times greater than the LOD.
You give yourself a little buffer.
You give yourself a buffer. It ensures the analysis will come back with a detectable, measurable result.
That's a smart strategy. So you're sampling for a little more than the lab needs, just in case. But then there's the opposite problem. If you pull too much air, you have to worry about the maximum sample volume.
Yes. And this is a critical and pretty common field failure point. It's called breakthrough.
Breakthrough.
Think about a sorbent tube packed with charcoal.
Yeah.
As you pull air through it, the charcoal starts grabbing the contaminant molecules, but it can only hold so much.
It gets saturated.
It gets saturated. And if you exceed its capacity, the contaminant just starts passing straight through the tube uncollected.
Which would give you a falsely low reading.
Dangerously low. You're completely underestimating the employee's exposure.
So how do you know if breakthrough has happened? How can you detect that?
Well, this is where the design of the sampling media is actually pretty clever. Most sorbent tubes are built with two distinct sections of sorbent. There's a large primary section in the front and then a smaller backup section behind it, and they're separated by a little plug of foam or something inert.
So it's like a main filter and a safety filter.
That's a great way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So you collect your sample as normal, but when the lab gets it, they analyze the primary section and the backup section separately.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yep. If the backup section contains more than, say, 10% of the total mass that was collected on the whole tube,
then, the front part got overloaded and stuff starts spilling over to the back.
that's your confirmation that breakthrough occurred. And that data point is invalid. The sample has to be discarded. The whole point of calculating the maximum sample volume beforehand is to make sure that doesn't happen.
That is a really crucial technical detail. The two-section tube is like a built-in fail-safe.
It is.
Okay, so let's move beyond a single sample. If we connect this to the bigger picture of protecting a whole workforce, you can't sample every single employee every single day.
No, of course not.
So how do you determine the minimum number of samples you need to collect to have confidence in your overall assessment?
The key concept here is representative sampling.
Okay.
If you have a large group of employees and they're all performing the exact same task in the same environment with the same materials, but say 30 welders on an assembly line.
You can group them together.
You can group them into what we call a similar exposure group, or in SEG. And then statistically, you can select a representative sample of workers from that group, maybe 5 to 7 people, and the results you get can be used to characterize the exposure for the entire group. It saves a lot of time and resources.
But our source material gives a really clear example where the regulations just override that efficiency, specifically with respirable crystalline silica.
This is a perfect example of a regulation demanding individualized precision. The silica standard is very, very specific. It requires the employer to assess the exposure of each employee who has the potential for exposure at or above the action level.
Not the group, but each employee.
Each individual employee.
And can you remind us what those benchmarks are for silica?
Sure. The OSHA permissible exposure limit, the PEL, is 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour time-weighted average, a TWA.
Okay, 50 is the limit.
And the action level, or AL, is half of that, 25 micrograms per cubic meter, also as an 8-hour TWA.
And the moment you hit that 25?
The moment your initial monitoring shows that an employee's potential exposure hits or goes over that 25 AL, the employer is immediately triggered into a whole cascade of mandatory requirements.
So what are some of those immediate practical consequences of exceeding that action level that a professional needs to have on their radar?
Well, it's a lot more than just, sampling again. Hitting that 25 AL triggers mandatory non-discretionary actions.
Like what?
Like the immediate implementation of a Witten exposure control plan. It triggers required medical surveillance for those employees.
Which includes things like x-rays.
Yes, baseline chest x-rays, spirometry to test lung function.
Yeah.
And it triggers specific worker training requirements. This is why the precision we were just talking about is so vital.
Because an inaccurate sample has huge consequences.
Huge. An inaccurate sample that underestimates exposure could lead to someone getting a chronic, preventable disease. But an inaccurate sample on the high side could trigger all these expensive and unnecessary regulatory compliance actions.
The math and the equipment selection, that's all the planning phase. Now we have to get into the execution, the step-by-step procedure in the field.
And this requires extreme attention to detail to avoid invalidating the sample, like we've been discussing.
So let's walk our listener through those crucial steps of pre-sampling preparation. What happens before you even turn the pump on?
Preparation really starts with the equipment and the paperwork. First, you have to meticulously assemble the equipment.
So the media goes in the holder.
Right. The filter cassette or the tube holder is connected to the tubing, which then connects to the pump. Then second, you perform that mandated pre-sampling calibration with your primary standard.
And you write it down immediately.
You record that calibration flow rate immediately on the air sampling worksheet. That worksheet isn't just a notepad. It's the official legal record of the sampling event.
And we can't forget the human element here. The employee briefing. I mean, you're about to attach a piece of regulatory equipment to a person for their entire shift.
This is such a critical administrative control, and it's a vital relationship-building moment.
You have to get them on your side.
You do. Employees need to be informed of the purpose of the sampling. You have to explain it's about protecting them, not about watching them. They need to understand how the pump works, and this is crucial, that they have to perform their work in their normal, typical fashion.
Because you need a representative sample of their actual exposure?
Exactly. If they get nervous and are overly cautious, or if on the flip side, they try to intentionally contaminate the sample.
Which can happen.
Oh, it can happen. If either of those things occur, the data becomes useless for assessing their true exposure. That briefing is essential for getting their cooperation and ensuring you get an accurate result.
So once everything's prepared, we move into the high-stakes phase, field implementation. This seems to be all about documentation and very precise placement.
Documentation is king. The samples have to be labeled with a unique numbering system before you ever place them on an employee. That number is the key identifier for that sample forever.
And that number gets transferred to the worksheet.
Immediately. Along with the person's name, a really detailed description of their location and the job they're doing, and a unique employee identifier like the last four of their social or an employee ID number.
I can see how poor field notes could just destroy good lab results.
They absolutely can. You could have a perfect sample, but if you don't know who it belongs to or what they were doing, it's worthless.
So where does the sampling pump and the media actually go on the worker?
Okay, so the pump itself is secured on the employee, usually clipped to a belt or carried in a special pouch. Then the tubing and the media run up to the employee's breathing zone.
And how is that breathing zone defined in practice? Is there a rule?
There is. It's technically defined as the area within a hemisphere of about 1 to 2 feet surrounding a person's nose and mouth. The whole goal is to collect the air that they are actually inhaling.
And I imagine a common mistake is placing it too far away.
It is. Clipping it to a hard hat, 2 feet above their face. That can miss key exposures, especially if the worker's, leaning down over their task.
But you also don't want it to get in their way.
No, absolutely not. While we want precision, you have to be very careful that the tubing doesn't restrict their movements or interfere with their work or any other PPE they have to wear.
Okay, so the shift ends. The sampling period is complete. We immediately move into the final field checks, the post-sampling steps.
Retrieval has to be immediate. You turn the pump off, and the safety professional has to perform the post-sampling calibration right away.
This is that final integrity check.
It's the ultimate integrity check. If that flow rate has drifted significantly, again, beyond that 5% tolerance, the sample volume calculation is unreliable.
And the sample is probably invalid.
The sample is likely invalidated. All of this information, the pre-flow, the post-flow, the total runtime, gets recorded and is used to calculate the final concentration. If you rush this step or skip it, all those hours of field work were for nothing.
After the numbers are checked, we have to deal with data processing and integrity. The field work might be over, but the sample's journey is not.
Not by a long shot. The safety of that sample is still paramount.
So what happens next?
As soon as the media is removed from the holder, it's immediately sealed, often with tamper-proof tape. Then it's prepared for shipment. And a lot of samples require cold storage during transit to stop the contaminant from degrading.
And this is where the legal documentation really kicks in.
This is where the chain to custody comes in, the QHSE. It's not just a shipping label. It's a legally required document that tracks who has possession of the sample from the moment it leaves the employee's breathing zone until it's physically on the analyst's bench at the lab.
And any gap in that chain is a major problem.
A major problem. Any gap in a signature or a timestamp could imply the sample was tampered with or compromised. It makes the results indefensible in a legal challenge or an OSHA case.
Wow. It really sounds like the paperwork is almost as important as the actual collection.
It is. The professional has to ensure all of this. The field notes, the calculations, the co-key form is all comprehensively documented and archived. This is the evidence. This is the foundation for every decision you'll make after this.
Okay, now this is where it gets, I think, really interesting for the modern professional. We've just laid out this incredibly meticulous procedural process.
Lots of numbers, lots of data points.
A massive amount of data for every single employee you sample. Calibration checks, volume math, labeling, chain of custody. Trying to manage all of this today without some sophisticated tools seems impossible.
Oh, trying to manage thousands of flow rates, hundreds of cookie forms, all the regulatory limits, historical data for dozens of similar exposure groups. Just using spreadsheets, it's completely unsustainable.
And just asking for errors.
It's incredibly prone to error. And this is where dedicated industrial hygiene software applications become. Well, they're not just a convenience anymore. They're mission-critical infrastructure.
And the source material points out a few of these specialized systems. We heard about one called Spearmid, and a major platform is Medgate.
Right, Medgate, which is now often part of larger EHS software suites. It offers these powerful modules that are designed specifically to automate the IH process.
And its features really mirror the complexity we've been talking about.
They do. They handle equipment management. So you're tracking the certification and calibration status of every single pump and calibrator you own.
So no out-of-date equipment gets used by mistake.
Exactly. They track monitoring history, they manage records for respirator fit testing, they handle the automatic generation of laboratory requisitions,
The paperwork.
all the paperwork, and they organize all the results from your qualitative monitoring as well.
The feature that really jumped out at me, though, was its ability to handle seg management, the similar exposure groups.
That is the real efficiency multiplier. I mean, imagine you have 10 different segs across your facility, manually trying to track the sampling rotation for each one, doing the statistical analysis to make sure the group is still representative.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It's a monumental task. This software automates it. And, crucially, it can perform the advanced statistical analysis that you need for regulatory compliance.
What kind of analysis?
Like calculating the 95th percentile confidence limit for the exposure of a seg. That's often a key metric you use to determine if your control measures are actually working. The software turns all that raw data into a risk metric, almost instantly.
And there was another system mentioned, Process MAP, which is part of a larger EHS program. It feels like the whole industry is moving toward these big integrated systems.
That is absolutely the trend. These systems give you accurate, centralized record keeping. They give the professional historical context. You can quickly pull up every measurement ever taken for a specific job or a specific employee.
Which lets the hygienist focus on the important stuff.
Right. It lets them focus on risk analysis and designing controls, rather than spending all their time on data entry.
So the lab sends back the data, the software organizes it all, and now we finally get to the ultimate goal of this entire process, interpreting the results.
Yes. The raw lab result, that mass they found, gets plugged into the formula. You use the average flow rate and the total time you recorded on your worksheet, and you calculate the final concentration, usually that 8-hour TWA.
And once you have that single number, there's one primary non-negotiable next step.
The comparison to limits.
You're benchmarking it against the regulatory limits, the OSHA PLs, or those more conservative action levels.
Exactly. You have to immediately compare your TWA result against the statutory limits. So let's bring back our respirable silica example.
Okay.
If the lab analysis comes back and you calculate a 30 micrograms per cubic meter TWA,
Right.
the professional knows instantly, okay, I'm above the action level of 25,
Yeah.
but I'm still below the PL of 50. And where you land on that regulatory spectrum dictates your immediate response.
And that regulatory response is really the ultimate payoff for this entire incredibly rigorous process.
It is. The successful completion of accurate air sampling directly leads to the core implications for the whole safety program.
So if the measurement is high,
If it's high, it gives you the quantitative proof you need to justify and implement engineering controls, like better ventilation or substituting a less toxic material.
and administrative controls,
And administrative controls like reducing a shift length. It gives you the basis for creating a formal written exposure control plan. It triggers all the necessary training for the affected employees.
So the entire cycle of hazard management really hinges on that one number.
It hinges on the accuracy of that air sampling measurement. Without that quantitative proof, control measures are often just. They're guessed at, they're poorly implemented, and they're very difficult to legally enforce.
This has been a really, really deep dive into the technical details and the methodical rigor behind chemical exposure assessment.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So to kind of synthesize this down for our listener, let's just review the 5 most critical pillars of knowledge from this whole journey.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Because the reliability of your final results and whether you can even take action on them really rests on these 5 foundational principles.
Okay, first up, the absolute necessity of picking the right capture mechanism.
Correct. You have to be able to accurately match the contaminant's physical state. Is it a gas, a vapor, a particulate to the right sampling media? You have to know when to use a filter, when to grab a charcoal sorbent tube, and when a whole air canister is your only option.
Because using the wrong one guarantees failure.
It guarantees a failed analysis.
Second, the integrity of the volume you collect is non-negotiable.
Absolutely. That requirement for pre- and post-sampling calibration is mandatory. It's not optional. This check, using a primary standard, validates that your flow rate was constant. And as we said, a drift of more than 5%.
When the whole thing is invalid.
The whole calculation is invalid.
Third, the math has to be precise, especially when it comes to the limits of the lab itself.
Right. We have to strategically calculate both the minimum and maximum sample volumes. The minimum volume makes sure you collect enough material to get over the lab's limit of detection.
So you get a real number back.
So you get a measurable result. And the maximum volume is calculated to prevent breakthrough, to make sure the sorbent media doesn't get saturated.
A condition we can check for using that backup section on the tube.
Exactly. And failure on either end, too low or too high, means the data is useless.
Fourth, the actual procedure in the field. It requires just obsessive adherence to the process and the legal paperwork.
Personal sampling is the gold standard for exposure. And that means precise placement in the employee's breathing zone. It means rigorous documentation of every start and stop time on that worksheet.
And the chain of custody.
And maintaining a strict chain of custody when you seal and ship that sample. That QHSE is your legal defense against any claim of sample contamination or tampering.
And finally, your analysis partner has to meet the highest possible standard.
Yes. The necessity of using AIHA-accredited laboratories is just paramount. That accreditation is your guarantee that the results were generated under strict quality control. It provides the validity and reliability you need for internal risk management and, of course, for external regulatory compliance.
You know, we started this deep dive with a simple choice between a filter and a sorbent tube. We scaled all the way through meticulous math, field procedures, and we ended up talking about complex software management systems like Medgate.
It's a huge scope.
It is. We've really peeled back the layers to show the incredible systematic rigor that goes into measuring workplace safety. This is not guesswork.
Not at all. It's a detailed, technical, and mathematically precise process. And it's all designed to produce one thing: an accurate 8-hour time-weighted average concentration.
And that accurate measurement is the key to control.
It is. For you as the learner, as the professional, the core value of all of this is understanding that effective hazard control has to start with accurate quantification. You simply cannot manage a chronic exposure, which is often invisible if you haven't measured it with this level of technical sophistication.
It moves safety from being reactive to being proactive.
It moves safety from reactive guesswork to proactive science.
We spent a lot of time talking about the implications of just hitting the action level for silica, how it immediately triggers mandatory controls and medical surveillance. And that just highlights the weight, the real-world consequence of that final TWA number.
It really does.
So with that in mind, here's a final provocative thought for you to explore on your own. We've seen that the field professional has to calculate the minimum sampling volume needed to make sure they collect enough material to get over the lab's limit of detection. So thinking about the hazards in your own environment that maybe aren't being measured right now, perhaps a trace contaminant that might exist at very, very low levels, what steps would you need to take to ensure your field strategy, your calculated flow rate and time, is actually sufficient to reliably collect a sample that the lab's LOD could even measure?
It's a great question. It's not enough just to run a pump.
You have to guarantee the result. This is something for you to mull or explore on your own.